There's a certain kind of person that a manipulator learns very quickly to avoid. Not because that person is aggressive, not because they fight back loudly or make a scene, but because something in them simply doesn't bend. You've probably never been told you have that quality. It doesn't come with a label. It doesn't announce itself. But if you've ever felt like certain people seemed uncomfortable around you, people who had no real reason to be, this might be for you. And if you've ever wondered why some relationships leave you feeling drained in a way you couldn't quite explain, stay with me. Because what we're about to explore isn't about tactics or defenses. It's about something that lives much deeper than that. It starts with a question most people never ask themselves. What does it feel like to be around someone who actually knows who they are, not who they've been told to be, not who they perform in public, but who they genuinely are, underneath all the noise? Most of us have spent years learning how to adjust ourselves, to be a little softer here, a little more agreeable there, to sense the mood of a room and shift accordingly. And we call that adaptability. We call that being easy to get along with. But there's a difference, a quiet, important difference, between someone who adapts because they're emotionally intelligent and someone who adapts because they've learned it isn't safe to be fully themselves. Manipulators know this difference instinctively. They look for the second kind of person. They're searching for the gap, the space between who you are and who you've learned to pretend to be. That gap is where they work. That's where the leverage lives. And when they encounter someone who doesn't have that gap, or who has slowly closed it, something shifts in them. An almost imperceptible hesitation, because they can't find the door. One of the quietest signs of a strong personality is something that might actually look like a flaw from the outside. You don't need to be liked by everyone. This sounds simple, but sit with it for a moment. Most of us carry a low-level, almost constant anxiety about how we're being perceived. We replay conversations. We wonder if we said something wrong. We soften our opinions preemptively before anyone even pushes back. That anxiety, that chronic need for approval, is one of the most powerful levers a manipulator can pull. But when someone has done the interior work of genuinely separating their self-worth from external validation, that lever stops working, not because they're cold, not because they don't care about people, but because they've learned that their sense of okayness doesn't depend on someone else's verdict. That's terrifying to someone who operates through control. And here's what makes it even more interesting. Strong personalities aren't always the loudest in the room. In fact, they're often the quietest. There's a kind of stillness that comes with knowing yourself, a groundedness that doesn't need to perform. They don't over-explain. They don't rush to fill silence. They don't seem to need the conversation to go a certain way. And that stillness? It reads, to someone looking for edges to pull on, as unreadable. Manipulators need to read you. They need to know what you want, what you fear, what you're ashamed of. They study the subtle signals, the nervous laugh, the quick agreement, the way your eyes drop when a certain subject comes up. But when someone is at home inside themselves, those signals are quieter, or they simply mean something different. If you're someone who tends to say what you mean, not harshly, but honestly, you may have noticed that certain people find you exhausting. Not because you're difficult, but because you're legible in the wrong way. You're honest rather than strategic. And honesty doesn't serve people who are used to navigating through ambiguity and distortion. This is worth pausing on, because it might reframe something painful. If you've ever been told you're too much, too direct, too observant, too unwilling to just go along, it's worth asking, too much for whom? Because sometimes what gets labeled as a flaw is actually a form of psychological integrity. And I want to leave that question open for a moment, because the next part changes how you hear it. Carl Rogers, one of the foundational thinkers in humanistic psychology, talked about what he called congruence. The alignment between what you feel on the inside and what you express on the outside. Most people live with a significant gap between those two things. They've learned to suppress, perform, and manage, and often for very understandable reasons. But the person who has moved toward congruence, who has allowed their inner world and outer expression to come into alignment, carries a different kind of energy. It's not about being raw or unfiltered. It's about being real. There's a warmth in it, and also a weight. You feel like you're actually talking to someone, not a presentation. Manipulators can't inhabit that space. They function through the gap, through the performance, through the version of you that you project for safety. When that gap closes, even partially, the dynamic shifts entirely. If this is resonating with something you've been carrying without a name for it, I gently invite you to stay close to this channel. Not because we have answers for you, but because this is a space where these questions live, where they're taken seriously, where you're not alone in asking them. There's another sign that's almost paradoxical. Strong personalities can tolerate being wrong. Not just intellectually, but emotionally. They can sit with the discomfort of having made a mistake, having misjudged something, having hurt someone unintentionally without completely unraveling. This sounds unremarkable until you realize what it implies. Someone who can tolerate being wrong doesn't need to construct elaborate justifications to protect their self-image. They don't need to shift blame. They don't need you to believe a particular story about them in order to feel okay about themselves. That's a kind of interior security that's almost impossible to leverage against. Because the most common form of manipulation works through shame. Through the threat, often implicit, sometimes explicit, of your own unworthiness. You don't know what you're talking about. You're overreacting. You're too sensitive. No one else has a problem with this. These are phrases designed to make you doubt your own perception, to make you more dependent on the other person's interpretation of reality. But someone with a stable sense of self can hear those phrases and ask genuinely, not defensively, is that true? And when it isn't, they don't crumble. They just return to themselves. There's a word for that kind of groundedness. And it isn't toughness, it's self-trust. And self-trust, once it takes root, changes everything about how you move through the world. Here's something that might sit uncomfortably. The fact that you've watched this far suggests something about you. Not that you're suspicious of everyone, not that you've been victimized, but that you're interested in understanding the interior dynamics of human relationship, the subtle, unspoken architecture of how people affect each other. That interest itself is a sign of something. People who live entirely on the surface, who never question, who accept every social dynamic at face value, don't usually find themselves drawn to this kind of reflection. If you felt this video, I want to ask something of you. Leave a comment below, not a performance, something real. A moment where you recognize something in yourself. A relationship that made more sense after hearing this. A question you've been carrying. And if this is the kind of conversation you want to keep having, subscribe, because we go deeper than this. Every time. Back to something that often gets mistaken for arrogance. A strong personality doesn't chase. They don't pursue approval. They don't overinvest in people who consistently undervalue them. And they don't perform enthusiasm. They don't feel in order to maintain relationships that aren't reciprocal. This isn't coldness. It's a kind of self-respect that's learned, usually through experiences that cost something. But here's what's interesting about it psychologically. Someone who doesn't chase communicates, without words, that they have a strong enough relationship with themselves to be alone if necessary. That their sense of wholeness doesn't require someone else's constant validation. That's deeply unsettling to a manipulator. Because their entire strategy depends on you needing them, needing their approval, their version of events, their presence as proof that you're worthwhile. When you stop needing that, when you can genuinely hold your own hand through the hard moments, the architecture of manipulation falls apart. Not dramatically, quietly, like a door that simply doesn't open anymore. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get named enough. Strong personalities have a particular relationship with discomfort, not a comfortable one, but an honest one. Most people, when something feels off, look for the fastest route out of the feeling. They distract, they rationalize. They reframe it into something more bearable before they've actually sat with what it's telling them. And manipulators count on that. They count on your discomfort being something you want to escape quickly. Because if you're trying to escape a feeling fast enough, you'll accept almost any story that makes it stop. But someone who has learned to stay with discomfort, to let it speak before they silence it, processes reality at a different speed. They don't rush to conclusions. They don't need the tension resolved before they've understood what created it. That patience with their own interior experience makes them harder to redirect, harder to confuse, harder to convince that what they felt wasn't real, because they already know what they felt. They sat with it long enough to know it by name. There's a kind of person who, after a strange conversation, doesn't just move on. They notice. They replay it. Not obsessively, but carefully. Like someone turning an object over in their hand, trying to understand its weight. That noticing is not paranoia, it's attunement. And attunement is one of the qualities that a manipulator finds most destabilizing in another person. Because the manipulator's art depends on subtlety, on small shifts that accumulate, on changes so gradual you can't point to any single moment where things went wrong. But someone who notices, who trusts their noticing, catches the pattern before it becomes a trap. They feel the temperature change before the storm arrives. There's another dimension to this that touches something almost philosophical. People with strong personalities tend to have a clear, if sometimes quiet, sense of their own values. Not a list of beliefs they've memorized, but a felt sense of what matters to them, what they can live with and what they can't. And that felt sense acts like an internal compass. When someone tries to slowly pull them in a direction that conflicts with that compass, they feel it. Not always as a loud alarm, sometimes as a subtle wrongness, a low friction, a resistance that doesn't have a name yet, but is already present. Values aren't just moral positions, they're orientation devices. They tell you where you are in relation to yourself. Someone without a clear sense of their values can be walked very far from themselves without ever realizing how lost they've become. The distance accumulates invisibly. But someone rooted in their own values has a reference point, and that reference point keeps calling them back. This is why manipulators often work hardest to erode values first, to introduce doubt about whether what you believe is really true, whether what you feel is really valid, whether the things you care about are actually worth caring about. Because once the compass is confused, direction becomes someone else's to provide. If you've ever been in a relationship, romantic, professional, or even familial, where you slowly stopped recognizing your own preferences, your own opinions, your own sense of what was acceptable, that might have been the compass being deliberately disrupted. And if that landed somewhere in your chest just now, if it brought something to the surface, that recognition itself is worth something. That's the compass still working. And sometimes, just realizing that the compass still works, that it never fully broke, even when someone tried hard to break it, is the beginning of something important. That moment of recognition doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't need to arrive with certainty or clarity. It can arrive quietly, the way most true things do. Like a breath you didn't realize you'd been holding. If this is the first video of ours you've watched, I want to invite you, genuinely, without pressure, to subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Not because the numbers matter more than the conversation, but because when you do that, you're telling the algorithm that this kind of depth is worth amplifying, that there are people out here who want more than noise. And if you've recognized something in yourself today, something you want to understand better, something you want to carry forward, drop it in the comments. Your reflection might be exactly what someone else needed to find the words for their own. Let's sit with one more thing before we move toward the close. People with strong personalities tend to have a complicated relationship with the word no, not because they can't say it, but because they've had to learn, sometimes over years, sometimes through a great deal of pain, that saying no doesn't make them a bad person. For many people, the inability to say no isn't weakness. It's a wound. It's the internalized belief that their boundaries are an inconvenience to others, that their needs are too much, that love is conditional on compliance. Manipulators don't create that wound, but they find it, and they stay close to it. The person who has healed or is in the process of healing that particular wound becomes someone who can say no without a 3-paragraph explanation, without preemptive apology, without the anxious monitoring of the other person's reaction that follows. They say no, and they let it be a complete sentence. That composure, to someone who is used to people bending under pressure, reads as something close to invulnerable. Not because they don't feel the social weight of the moment, they do, but because they've decided, somewhere deep and private, that their own integrity is worth a little discomfort. That decision, quiet, firm, made long before the conversation started, is what manipulators encounter and cannot move past. Here's something that might feel unexpected. Strong personalities are often deeply empathetic, not in the performed, people-pleasing sense, but in the genuine, attentive sense. They listen. They pick up on what's unspoken. They're often acutely aware of the emotional temperature of a room, and that empathy is sometimes mistaken, even by themselves, as a vulnerability, as evidence that they care too much, feel too much. But genuine empathy, when it's paired with a stable sense of self, is not a liability. It's discernment, because they can feel into another person's experience without losing their own footing. They can understand where someone is coming from without being obligated to follow them there. That combination, deep feeling and interior stability, is genuinely rare, and it creates a kind of presence that is warm, but not porous, open, but not manipulable. It's the difference between a window and a wall. Light passes through, but the structure holds. If you're someone who has been told your empathy makes you weak, that you feel too much, that you should harden up, I want you to hear something different. Your capacity to feel isn't the problem. The problem was never the feeling. It was the absence of a stable enough self to hold the feeling without being swept away by it. And that self, that quiet, solid, quietly expanding self, is what this entire conversation has been pointing toward. If you've stayed with this until now, I'd like you to do something for me, not as an obligation, but as a small act of self-recognition. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and leave a comment, even just one word, about what this brought up for you. Because sometimes the most important thing isn't the answer. It's finally feeling like your question was heard. And there's one final thing worth sitting with. The strongest personalities aren't the ones who never feel afraid, never feel uncertain, never get thrown by a difficult relationship or a destabilizing moment. They're the ones who have learned, often slowly, often painfully, to return to themselves, not to a perfect self, not to a self that has everything figured out, but to a self that is fundamentally okay, fundamentally real, fundamentally theirs. Carl Rogers called it becoming a person, not performing a person, not constructing a person, but allowing yourself to unfold into who you actually are, without requiring the world's permission first. And that unfolding, that quiet, ongoing process of coming home to yourself, is something no manipulator can follow you into. Because it doesn't happen in the space between you and them. It happens in the space between you and you. If something in this conversation moved something in you, if a thought surfaced that you want to hold on to, let this be the moment you hit subscribe and leave a like, not as a transaction, but as a signal to yourself that this kind of inner work matters to you, that you want to keep going, because you're not done yet, and neither is this conversation.